In the vast, silent theater of the cosmos, a single drama has captivated the world like no other. It's a story of courage, of ingenuity, of a species reaching out from its terrestrial cradle to touch another celestial body. July 20th, 1969, a date seared into the annals of history. On that day, an estimated 650 million people, a fifth of the world's population at the time, gathered around flickering television sets and crackling radios. They were united by a single, breathtaking spectacle: humanity's first steps on the lunar surface. The grainy, ghost-like images transmitted from 250,000 miles away showed a bulky figure in a white suit descending a small ladder. Then came the words, a simple sentence that would echo through the ages: "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." Neil Armstrong, an astronaut from a small town in Ohio, had stepped onto the moon. It was the crowning achievement of a generation, the fulfillment of a seemingly impossible dream, and a moment of profound unity for a world often torn apart by conflict. But what if that unifying moment, that giant leap, was a lie? What if the most watched television event in history was nothing more than the most ambitious and expensive film production ever staged? Imagine for a moment that the lunar landscape was not the sea of tranquility, but a meticulously crafted set in a secure, undisclosed location, that the strange, ethereal light was not the unfiltered glare of the sun in a vacuum, but the carefully arranged glow of studio spotlights, and that the heroes we celebrated were merely actors playing their parts in a grand deception, a multi-billion-dollar hoax designed to win a technological war and deceive the entire planet. For a significant and steadfast number of people, this is not imagination. It is the truth. For them, the footage is filled with clues, the photographs riddled with anomalies, and the official narrative is a fragile house of cards. They ask questions that seem, at first glance, to be unanswerable. Why does the American flag appear to wave in the windless vacuum of space? Why are there no stars in the lunar sky? How could the astronauts have survived the deadly radiation of the Van Allen belts? This is the other side of the story, a narrative of suspicion, of deep-seated mistrust, and of a search for a truth they believe has been deliberately hidden. Tonight, we journey back to that iconic moment in history, but we will travel down to parallel paths, the triumphant story of Apollo 11, and the persistent, pervasive theory that it was all an elaborate fraud. We will dissect the evidence, examine the motives, and explore the psychology behind one of the most enduring and explosive controversies of our time. This is the story of the moon landing, and the story of why millions believe it never happened. To truly grasp the monumental pressure that rested on the shoulders of the Apollo program, we must first rewind the clock to a world divided. The late 1950s and 1960s were not a time of global harmony. The planet was cleaved into by the ideological chasm of the Cold War. On one side stood the United States and its allies, champions of capitalism and democracy. On the other, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, standard-bearers of communism. It was a conflict fought not primarily with armies on traditional battlefields, but with spies, with propaganda, with economic influence, and, crucially, with technological prowess. Every new invention, every scientific breakthrough was framed as a victory for one system over the other, and the newest, most dramatic arena for this contest was the vast, unexplored territory of space. The starting pistol for the space race was fired on October 4, 1957. On that day, the Soviet Union stunned the world by successfully launching Sputnik 1, a small, polished sphere just 23 inches in diameter. As it orbited the Earth, its simple, beeping radio signal was a constant, a nerving reminder to the West that they were falling behind. The Sputnik crisis ignited a firestorm of anxiety in the United States. It was a blow not just to American pride, but to its perceived sense of security. If the Soviets could put a satellite into orbit, what else could they do? Could they launch nuclear missiles from space? The fear was palpable, and the need to respond was immediate. The Soviets pressed their advantage, racking up an astonishing series of firsts. In 1959, their Lunar 2 probe became the first man-made object to reach the moon's surface. Then, on April 12, 1961, came the masterstroke, a 27-year-old cosmonaut named Yuri Gagarin was launched into orbit aboard the Vostok 1 spacecraft, becoming the first human being to journey into outer space. His 108-minute flight was a global sensation and a resounding propaganda victory. For the Soviet Union, Premier Nikita Khrushchev boasted that communism was the future, and the heavens themselves seemed to agree. For the new American president, John F. Kennedy, the situation was untenable. The United States, a nation that prided itself on its technological and industrial might, was being consistently and publicly outmaneuvered. Something bold, something audacious, was needed to capture the world's imagination and reclaim the lead. Just over a month after Gagarin's flight, on May 25, 1961, Kennedy stood before a joint session of Congress and threw down the gauntlet. He did not propose a small, incremental goal. He proposed a leap of breathtaking ambition. His words would become the mission statement for a decade. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. The Apollo program was born from this challenge. It was an undertaking of almost unimaginable scale. At its peak, it would employ over 400 people and involve the collaboration of more than 20,000 industrial firms and universities. It would require the invention of new technologies, the development of new materials, and the solving of countless engineering problems that had never before been encountered. The centerpiece of the program was the Saturn V, a gargantuan three-stage rocket standing 363 feet tall. Taller than the Statue of Liberty, it remains, to this day, the most powerful rocket ever successfully flown. The path to the moon was far from smooth. It was paved with both stunning successes and devastating failures. The early, unmanned missions tested the hardware. The Mercury and Gemini programs taught NASA how to get astronauts into space, how to keep them alive, and how to perform complex maneuvers like spacewalking and orbital rendezvous. But the immense danger of the Enterprise was brought into horrific focus on January 27, 1967. During a routine launch rehearsal for what was to be the first manned Apollo mission, a fire broke out in the command module. The pure oxygen environment, pressurized above normal atmospheric levels, turned a small spark into an inferno. Trapped inside, astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee perished. The tragedy shocked the nation and grounded the Apollo program for over a year. But it also led to a sweeping redesign of the spacecraft, making it safer and more reliable. The determination to reach the moon, now tinged with the memory of fallen comrades, only intensified. The program resumed with a renewed sense of purpose. Apollo 7 tested the redesigned command module in Earth orbit. Apollo 8, in a bold and brilliant move at Christmas of 1968, sent 3 astronauts, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders, on a journey all the way to the moon. They didn't land, but they became the first humans to orbit another celestial body. From that vantage point, they captured one of the most iconic photographs in history, Earthrise, a stunning image of our fragile, blue and white planet rising above the barren lunar horizon. It was a moment of profound perspective and a powerful demonstration of America's growing capabilities. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module, the Spidery, delicate craft that would make the final descent in the safety of Earth orbit. Apollo 10 was a full dress rehearsal, taking the lunar module, nicknamed Snoopy, to within just 9 miles of the moon's surface before returning to the command module. Charlie Brown. Everything was now in place. The technology had been tested, the procedures rehearsed. The stage was set for Apollo 11. The official story of Apollo 11 is a saga of precision, courage, and near-flawless execution. It began on a hot Florida morning, July 16, 1969. The world watched as the colossal Saturn V rocket stood gleaming on Launchpad 39A at the Kennedy Space Center. On board, nestled in the command module they had named Columbia, were the 3 men chosen for this historic endeavor. Commander Neil Armstrong, a quiet, experienced test pilot. Lunar module pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin, a brilliant engineer with a doctorate in astronautics, and Command Module pilot Michael Collins, a calm, eloquent astronaut who would perform the crucial, lonely task of orbiting the moon while his crewmates descended. At 9:32 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the 5 F-1 engines of the Saturn V's first stage ignited, generating an earth-shattering 7.6 million pounds of thrust. The ground shook for miles around as the rocket slowly, majestically, climbed into the sky, carrying the hopes of a nation with it. For 3 days, the crew of Apollo 11 traveled through the black void of space, the Earth shrinking behind them to a beautiful, marbled sphere. On the 4th day, they entered lunar orbit. The moment of truth had arrived. Armstrong and Aldrin transferred into the lunar module, which they had christened Eagle. After a final systems check, they separated from Columbia, where Michael Collins would remain, a solitary human outpost orbiting 60 miles above the lunar surface. As Collins watched the Eagle recede, he later wrote, "I am now truly alone and absolutely isolated from any known life. I am it." The descent was the most perilous phase of the mission. Armstrong and Aldrin were flying a machine that had never before landed. As they neared the surface, their onboard computer, which had less processing power than a modern smartphone, began to sound a series of alarms. It was a 12:02 alarm, indicating the computer was overloaded with tasks, with the clock ticking and fuel running low. The decision of whether to abort fell to the flight controllers back in Houston. A young engineer named Steve Bales made a split-second call. The alarm was not critical. The landing could proceed. But another problem arose. Armstrong, now manually piloting the craft, realized their designated landing zone was littered with large boulders. He took semi-automatic control, searching for a safe spot to land. With less than 30 seconds of fuel remaining, he gently guided the Eagle down. On July 20th, 1969, at 4:17 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, a probe on one of the Eagle's landing legs touched the lunar soil. Armstrong's voice, remarkably calm, crackled across the 240,000-mile distance to Mission Control. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." The response from Houston was a collective sigh of relief, followed by the words of Capcom. "Charlie Duke, Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." For the next 6.5 hours, the astronauts prepared for their moonwalk. Finally, the hatch opened. Neil Armstrong carefully backed out onto the small platform at the top of the ladder. He switched on the television camera and a ghostly, black and white image was beamed to a captivated world. He descended the ladder, and as his boot touched the fine, powdery lunar soil, he spoke the words that would be forever etched in history. He was soon joined on the surface by Buzz Aldrin, who described the scene with poetic simplicity as magnificent desolation. For 2 hours and 31 minutes, the two men explored this new world. They planted the American flag, a moment of potent symbolism. They collected 47 pounds of lunar rocks and soil samples. They set up scientific experiments, including a seismometer to measure moonquakes and a laser reflector to allow for precise measurements of the Earth-Moon distance. They hopped and bounded in the low lunar gravity, 1/6 that of Earth's. Their movements a strange, dreamlike ballet. All the while, Michael Collins orbited above, passing in and out of radio contact with Earth every 48 minutes. As Columbia circled to the far side of the Moon, after their historic moonwalk, Armstrong and Aldrin returned to the Eagle, exhausted but exhilarated. They rested, then prepared for the critical ascent to rendezvous with Collins. The single engine of the Eagle's ascent stage had to fire perfectly. There was no backup. It did. The Eagle docked flawlessly with Columbia, and the precious cargo of lunar samples and human explorers was transferred for the journey home. On July 24th, the Columbia capsule blazed back through Earth's atmosphere, splashing down safely in the Pacific Ocean, where the crew was recovered by the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. The promise John F. Kennedy had made 8 years earlier had been fulfilled. Humanity had walked on the moon. But this triumphant narrative, so deeply embedded in our culture, is not the only version of the story. For some, the ink had barely dried on the history books before the questions began. The first whispers of doubt emerged in the years following the Apollo program, a time of national turmoil in America. The Vietnam War had eroded public trust in the government, and the Watergate scandal shattered it. A cynical mood took hold, a sense that official stories could no longer be taken at face value. It was in this climate of suspicion that the moon landing hoax theory was born. The first prominent voice of this dissent was Bill Kaysing. Kaysing was not a scientist or an engineer, but he had a background that gave his claims a veneer of insider knowledge. He had worked as a technical writer for Rocketdyne, one of the companies that had built the powerful F-1 engines for the Saturn V rocket, in 1976. He self-published a book called We Never Went to the Moon, America as $30 Billion Swindle. This book became the foundational text of the hoax movement, laying out a series of arguments and anomalies that proponents continue to cite to this day. Kaysing argued that the technology of the 1960s was simply not advanced enough to achieve a lunar landing, and that NASA, facing insurmountable technical hurdles and immense political pressure, opted to fake the entire event rather than admit defeat to the Soviets. Let us now delve into these claims, the pillars of the conspiracy theory, and examine the evidence that has convinced millions that the giant leap for mankind was, in fact, faked in a studio. The most visually arresting and frequently cited piece of evidence is the American flag. In the video footage and photographs from the Apollo 11 mission, the flag planted by Armstrong and Aldrin stands proudly, its fabric seemingly rippling and waving. But this immediately raises a fundamental question. How can a flag wave in a place with no atmosphere? The moon is, for all intents and purposes, a vacuum. There is no wind, no breeze to make a flag flutter. For believers in the hoax theory, the answer is simple and damning. The moon landing was filmed on a secret government soundstage, and the waving flag is the result of a draft or a hidden fan. A careless mistake by the filmmakers that exposes the entire fraud. It's a powerful image, one that seems to defy the basic laws of physics as we understand them. Next, we turn our gaze to the lunar sky. In every single photograph taken by the astronauts on the surface of the moon, the sky is a deep, uniform, pitch black. There are no stars. This strikes many as deeply counterintuitive. From Earth on a clear night far from city lights, the sky is a brilliant carpet of stars. On the moon, with no atmosphere to obscure the view, shouldn't the stars be even more numerous and dazzlingly bright? Conspiracy theorists argue that NASA deliberately left the stars out of the photographs. Why? Because faking a precise, astronomically correct star field for the exact time and location of the landing would have been incredibly difficult. They feared that any amateur astronomer could analyze the star patterns and prove that the photos were not taken from the moon. To avoid this risk, they simply opted for a sterile, black backdrop. It was, they claim, a massive and telling oversight. The play of light and shadow in the Apollo imagery is another fertile ground for suspicion. The sun is the only significant source of light on the moon. Therefore, basic physics dictates that all shadows cast by the astronauts and their equipment should be parallel to one another. However, critics have pored over the photographic archive and identified numerous examples where shadows appear to fall in different directions. In some famous images, the shadow of an astronaut and the shadow of a nearby rock seem to diverge at odd angles. To the conspiracist, this is irrefutable proof of multiple light sources. The scene, they argue, must have been lit with artificial studio lighting. Spotlights and fill lights placed at various positions, just as a film director would arrange them. The non-parallel shadows are a clear signature of a staged production, not the harsh, single-source light of the sun in a vacuum. Adding to this is the observation that objects in shadow on the moon are often surprisingly well illuminated. If the sun is the only light source, shouldn't shadows be pitch black? The fact that we can see details on the side of the lunar module that is in shadow, or on the front of an astronaut's suit when his back is to the sun, suggests the presence of a secondary light source, a fill light, to make the scene more visible for the camera. Then there is the formidable barrier of the Van Allen radiation belts. Discovered in 1958 by American scientist James Van Allen, These are vast, donut-shaped zones of intensely charged particles trapped by Earth's magnetic field. Traveling through these belts exposes any spacecraft and its occupants to significant levels of radiation. Hoax proponents argue that the radiation levels are so high that they would have either killed the astronauts on their way to the moon or, at the very least, made them gravely ill. They claimed that the thin aluminum skin of the Apollo command module offered nowhere near enough shielding to protect the crew. The technology to overcome this lethal radiation, they insist, simply did not exist in the 1960s and may not even exist today. Therefore, the entire journey was impossible from the outset. NASA, they believe, knew this and never sent the astronauts beyond low Earth orbit. The mystery of the missing tapes adds another layer of intrigue and suspicion. For years, researchers and journalists sought to obtain the original slow-scan television recordings of the Apollo 11 moonwalk. These original tapes were of a much higher quality than the grainy, converted images that were broadcast to the world. But in 2006, NASA delivered a stunning admission: they couldn't find them. The agency confessed that in a cost-saving measure during the 1970s and 80s, an estimated 100,000 tapes, including the originals from the Apollo 11 mission, had been degaussed, magnetically erased, and reused, while NASA did subsequently find and restore high-quality copies from other sources. The destruction of the original, primary evidence has been a gift to conspiracy theorists. They see it not as an unfortunate administrative blunder, but as a deliberate act of destruction. What, they ask, was on those original tapes that NASA so desperately needed to hide? Perhaps glitches in the production, stray props, or other telltale signs of a faked environment. This brings us to the grandest and most cinematic of all the theories: the idea that the moon landings were a Hollywood production, masterminded by a legendary film director. The name most often associated with this theory is Stanley Kubrick. The timing is, for theorists, highly suspicious. In 1968, just a year before the Apollo 11 mission, Kubrick released his masterpiece, 2001, A Space Odyssey. The film was lauded for its stunningly realistic depiction of space travel and its convincing lunar landscapes. The special effects were revolutionary, far ahead of their time. Proponents of the Kubrick theory suggest that NASA, realizing it could not actually get to the moon, secretly recruited Kubrick and his team to fake it. They argue that the government gave Kubrick a virtually unlimited budget and access to secret technology in exchange for his silence. While it remains one of the more fringe theories, it has captured the public imagination, a compelling tale of artifice and conspiracy at the highest levels of power and cinema. These theories, taken together, paint a compelling and disturbing picture. They challenge a moment of history that many hold sacred. But for every claim, for every supposed anomaly, the scientific community and NASA have provided detailed, evidence-based explanations. The battle for the truth of the moon landing is fought not just in the court of public opinion, but in the realm of physics, geology, and photographic science. Let us return to that waving flag. The explanation has nothing to do with a hidden fan or a drafty film set. The problem was logistical. How do you display a flag in a vacuum where there is no wind to make it unfurl? NASA engineers solved this by including a telescoping horizontal rod that extended from the top of the flagpole. The astronauts were supposed to pull this rod out to its full length to make the flag hang flat. However, they found it difficult to extend the rod completely, so the nylon flag didn't stretch taut. This caused the fabric to ripple and wrinkle, an effect which, in still photographs, looks remarkably like a flag fluttering in the wind. The motion seen in the video occurred as Armstrong and Aldrin twisted the pole back and forth to plant it firmly in the lunar soil. In the airless environment of the moon, there is no air resistance to damp the motion. So, once it was set in motion, the flag continued to swing back and forth for some time, like a pendulum. It wasn't waving in the wind, it was responding to the energy the astronauts had put into it. The mystery of the missing stars is also not a mystery at all to anyone familiar with photography. The lunar surface during the daytime is a brilliantly lit environment. The sun's light, unfiltered by any atmosphere, is incredibly harsh and bright. The The astronauts' white spacesuits were also highly reflective, to take a properly exposed photograph of this dazzlingly bright scene. The camera's settings needed a fast shutter speed and a small aperture. These settings are designed to limit the amount of light hitting the film. While they were perfect for capturing the details of the astronauts and the lunar landscape, they were completely wrong for capturing the faint, distant light of the stars. It is exactly the same reason you cannot see stars during the daytime on Earth. The bright blue sky, illuminated by the sun, washes them out. If you were to take a photo of a friend in a sunlit park, your friend would be properly exposed. But the sky would contain no stars. To capture the stars, the astronauts would have needed to use a long exposure, which would have completely overexposed and washed out the foreground, turning the astronauts and the landscape into a featureless white blur. The issue of the non-parallel shadows can be attributed to a combination of two factors: perspective and an uneven landscape. When parallel lines recede into the distance, they appear to converge at a vanishing point. This is a basic principle of artistic perspective. Furthermore, the lunar surface is not a flat, level studio floor. It is covered in craters, ridges, and gentle slopes. A shadow falling on a piece of ground that slopes away from the viewer will appear longer and angled differently than a shadow falling on a piece of ground that slopes towards the viewer. The seemingly divergent shadows are simply an optical illusion, created by the interplay of perspective and the undulating lunar terrain. As for the claim that objects in shadow are too well lit, this ignores a second, very significant source of light on the moon itself. The bright, dusty lunar surface acts as a massive reflector. Sunlight hits the ground and bounces off in all directions, illuminating objects that are in shadow. This reflected light from the ground is what allows us to see details on the side of the lunar module or the front of an astronaut's suit, even when they are not in direct sunlight. This is not a sign of artificial fill lighting. It is a natural consequence of the moon's reflective properties. The challenge of the Van Allen radiation belts was indeed a serious one, and NASA's engineers spent a great deal of time and effort figuring out how to deal with it. The solution was threefold. First, the trajectory of the Apollo missions was carefully planned to pass through the belts as quickly as possible and to avoid the areas of most intense radiation. The total time spent transiting the belts was only a couple of hours. Second, the command module itself provided significant shielding. The metal hull of the spacecraft, along with the equipment and storage lockers lining its walls, absorbed a large portion of the radiation particles. Finally, while the radiation levels are dangerous for long-term exposure are short, rapid transit does not deliver a fatal dose. The radiation exposure received by the Apollo astronauts was monitored with dosimeters and was found to be well within the safety limits established for astronauts and radiation workers. In fact, on average, they received a dose similar to that of a patient undergoing a full-body CT scan, a level that is not considered acutely dangerous. The argument of the missing tapes, while feeding into a narrative of a cover-up, is ultimately a story of poor record-keeping, not conspiracy. In the 1970s, magnetic tape was extremely expensive. The idea that these specific tapes would become priceless historical artifacts was not a primary concern. NASA, like many government agencies at the time, had a policy of reusing tapes to save money. The tapes from the Apollo 11 mission were part of a massive archive of over 100,000 tapes that were discarded and put back into circulation. It was a bureaucratic blunder, a regrettable loss of historical data, but there is no evidence to suggest it was a deliberate act to hide anything. The crucial point is that the content of those tapes was never secret. It was broadcast live. Around the world, the restored footage we have today, sourced from broadcast stations and other archives, is a faithful record of what those original tapes contained. Beyond these specific rebuttals, there is an overwhelming mountain of physical evidence that independently verifies the moon landings. The most tangible evidence is the 842 pounds of moon rocks brought back by the 6 Apollo missions that landed on the moon. These rocks have been distributed to and studied by thousands of scientists in laboratories all over the world. They are fundamentally different from any rocks found on Earth. They show no signs of weathering by water or wind. They contain isotopes formed by long-term exposure to high-energy cosmic rays on the airless lunar surface. They are pristine, ancient artifacts from another world, and their age and composition perfectly match our understanding of the Moon's geology. To fake these rocks would have required a secret program to manufacture hundreds of pounds of geologically unique material and fool the entire global scientific community, a conspiracy far more complex than faking the landing itself. Furthermore, several of the Apollo missions left behind scientific instruments on the lunar surface that are still operational. The laser retroflectors left by Apollo 11, 14, and 15 are a prime example. For decades, observatories on Earth have been able to aim powerful lasers at these reflectors and measure the time it takes for the light to bounce back. This has allowed for incredibly precise measurements of the Moon's orbit and has provided key evidence for Einstein's theory of general relativity. These reflectors are still being used by scientists today, providing a constant, verifiable confirmation that the equipment is, in fact, sitting on the surface of the Moon. We must also consider the geopolitical context. During the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union had a massive intelligence network dedicated to monitoring the United States. Every move. They were America's direct competitors in the space race. They tracked the Apollo missions with their own technology. If the United States had attempted to fake the Moon landing, the Soviets would have had every incentive to expose the fraud. It would have been the greatest propaganda victory in history. The fact that the Soviet Union, America's bitterest rival, acknowledged the success of the Apollo 11 mission is perhaps the most powerful piece of evidence of all. They never once, in any official capacity, suggested that the landing was a hoax. They knew it was real because their own tracking data confirmed it. So, if the scientific evidence is so overwhelming, why does the conspiracy theory persist? Why, more than half a century later, do a significant number of people still believe that the Moon landing was a hoax? The answer has less to do with the evidence itself, and more to do with the complexities of human psychology and our relationship with trust, authority, and belief. Conspiracy theories are not a modern phenomenon, but the Moon landing hoax emerged at a perfect storm of cultural and technological change. The 1970s saw a precipitous decline in public trust in institutions, particularly the government. Events like the Vietnam War and Watergate fostered a deep-seated cynicism and a sense that the public was being systematically lied to. This created fertile ground for theories that posited vast, nefarious plots by those in power. The Apollo program, as a government-run initiative, became an easy target for this newfound skepticism.